What happened at work that made everyone quit at once? Worked at a chain pizza place. The manager didn't approve of how well we cleaned and prepped for the next day. So we all came into a note saying something to the effect of "You are all replaceable," so we all said okay. Took off the uniform and left. We didn't even lock up or close up shop, just walked off. Phones were ringing for orders. There were people coming into the dining area but nobody was there working. Once she realized nobody was there, she was calling everyone, going nuts, telling us to come to work or we're fired. One person went back and tried to save it. I just reminded her that I was replaceable, and so was the person who signed my check. Then hung up. They had to close for about a week or two to replace the staff. The location completely closed and filed bankruptcy less than a year later, at least partly due to her leadership. The location is a Verizon store now. Company did a survey of employee happiness. It had super limited answers. We filled it out and tried to explain that, internally, our team was doing well and we were happy, but just about everyone had problems with 2 other employees outside the team who were bullies in important positions. The company asked us instead what we could do better so the bullies don't bully. Over half the team quit within a month, which is unheard of at that company, and our team was slashed as a cornerstone of the entire business. Worked in a call center offering free public transport brochures to people living in a city. The place was poorly managed. It was contracted out by the local government and only cared about numbers. Early during one shift, a spate of bombings on public transport killed a load of people around the city. After a few calls of getting abuse from people aghast we were trying to get their details to send them bus/train timetables, etc., we collectively stopped making calls. We assumed management would pause the project for that week at least, maybe longer, out of respect for what had happened. Our manager put her foot down and told us we must continue calling that morning, and as we were only on temporary contracts, anyone who refused may face being replaced. Then she stormed off. The entire team quit on the spot. We just got up and left without speaking to her again. We called up the work agency to let them know and they did not blame us. We were all replaced, but the local government office heard what had happened and pulled the plug on the contract with that call center within a month. I worked at a bakery a while back, and while enjoyable at times, it was generally a nightmare. There was one highlight though, and that was our second manager. We had 3 managers and the first and third were okay, but they never really motivated people and at times could be very rude. Our second manager, however, was amazing. She was always encouraging, kind, understanding, and I never heard her get angry. She was the type of person who was meant to be a leader, and she did her job well, too well. Corporate decided to transfer her to another location since that one was failing, and pretty much everyone quit the moment we found out she was leaving. She was the glue that held us together, and I still remember her as one of the best bosses I've ever had. Smallish company with a very necessary programming team of 5 people. CEO spent several $100,000 repainting and refurbishing the building, deciding he didn't like the color, and got it redone in the same month. Then lockdown hit and the company was suddenly struggling for money. CEO decided to retrench 2 of our team members. At first we thought that he picked those 2 because they were less familiar with the systems, but then the other 3 of us were told by the CEO that those 2 were in the most rough positions financially, and one was expecting another kid in a few weeks, and that this meant that they could hire them back as contractors for cheap because they'd be desperate. In the next week the 3 of us chatted among ourselves, all resigned, and they had to keep the other 2 devs on with their standard paycheck for longer, all while looking for new places to work. Not my work, but close friends. Restaurant owner wasn't paying his staff and checks kept bouncing, so one night, they all said fuck this, closed up shop together and left. Owner got ran out of town after social media and reg media took over. He closed down both of his places. The second also had a staff walk out the week prior to the first, and sold the buildings. Edit, since people keep asking. This was in MD. And the second place was his second restaurant, Indian place, that had kitchen staff walk out a week prior. But the walkout didn't close the restaurant. He closed it and sold it after his first restaurant was shuttered. Good riddance. I worked at a KFC in the 80s. We had a really cool manager. I was assistant manager along with another, and lots of other great young people worked there. Our manager was hired to turn around the store and he was given a budget to buy new equipment. He also saved money on paper products and got the store really clean with our help. At the end of the year, he was fired by the upper management for spending too much. They then brought in a new manager who immediately set about giving us all a hard time. Everyone walked. The store had to shut down for several days and the new guy brought in his family to help run it. The store shut down permanently a few years later. The district manager offered me a job in management, but I just didn't trust them at that point. Worked at Dairy Queen. Someone was stealing money regularly during the closing shift. Many of us had a suspicion of who it was, and I'm pretty sure most of us told our manager for fear of being blamed ourselves. We were certain it was the assistant manager who was with us on those closing shifts. Instead, our manager started randomly firing younger staff members for any minor discretion and blaming the missing money on them. When they fired me, it was the last straw, and several of my coworkers walked out in solidarity. Newsflash, it was the assistant manager all along. I ended up threatening to go to the labor board and they kind of paid me off. Edit, this was about 15 years ago. I'm very much over it. It was my first real job in high school and I was there for almost 2 years. I'm Canadian. It was in DQ in Ontario, and my boss knew she was in for a world of trouble if I disclosed some of their practices. I did not sign an NDA. I think my manager was afraid to let anything get to a higher level. They added like $1,000 to my final paycheck that had no real explanation why it was there. In all honesty, it could have been that I was young and didn't quite understand how loose ends get tied up after someone is fired. Maybe their version of severance, I really don't know. That's just how my 17-year-old brain made sense of it at the time. Anyways, I see that assistant manager out and about all the time, and after all this time she still can't look in my direction. One of my first jobs was as a dishwasher at a local steakhouse, which was always really busy as it overlooked the waterfalls of the local river. My third or fourth day working, the whole kitchen staff just didn't show up. Except for me. Boss grabbed me and taught me how to cook as we went. Not only had I never cooked before, this was a Friday night and I was missing a concert. So I was kind of angry about that. Probably not the culinary experience some of the customers expected that night. But I tried my best. Then, after we closed, I had to stick around for another 4 hours to wash dishes. Turns out everybody went to the concert. This was almost 40 years ago. Still mad. I worked at a bread manufacturing plant. This happened in the bagging area. A worker tripped and somehow the way he landed, his hand slipped underneath the machine guard and into a chain. Cut off his arm just below the elbow. The supervisor insisted we just wipe off the machine with a towel and continue running the rest of the already baked product. 12 out of 16 including myself quit. I found out later the manager fired that supervisor that day. Worked at a cheap clothing retail store while I was in college, 15 to 20 hours/week for the first several months, as was most of the staff. Then we got a new manager who decided that the state-mandated paid breaks, 15 minutes after 4 hours, were a waste of money. So he changed everyone's shifts to 3 hours 45 minutes or less so no one would get a paid break. Then people complained. So he hired a bunch of new people and reduced the old staff to about 1 shift a week. Lost pretty much everyone who actually knew what they were doing in less than a month. I heard most of the new people also quit pretty quickly, once they figured out how dumbly the place was run. We didn't all quit at once, but within a week or two of the event. It was an optometrist's office, and I was one of just 4 employees. The doctor invited another practice to move in and share space with us in our already cramped and disorganized office. We had to do all the work to make room for them. The doctor never broke from her usual routine to help us with the transition, or stayed late as we all did. Then the new doctor arrived, having let all of his staff go, assuming that we would work for him, without being paid by him. The practices weren't merging in any way. He hired only one person, who was barely out of high school, who had no idea what they were doing. Guess who had to train them? And the doctor never reduced the amount of appointments we took. We had our usual heavy workload all along. Our patients shared a waiting room with theirs. They were not prompt in taking their patients back, but we were. Their patients threw us dirty looks, and sometimes yelled at us for ignoring them, but we were forbidden from saying anything to them about why we ever helped only half the people who came in the door, or why we couldn't answer their questions and had to redirect them to the least knowledgeable person in the room. The other doctor's one employee. The doctor refused point blank to listen to any of our concerns. We all quit, and the practice sold out to one of the eyeglass chains a few months later. When the manager said they could train monkeys to do the job, so all the staff retired, and they had to halt operations until they hired 2 staff to be on call all the time. Guess how long that lasted? Manager kept pitching Amway to us on breaks and then cut hours of those that didn't sign up under him. We worked in retail at the mall. COVID hit the FedEx supply chain, broke the entire system and exposed bad management. The pressure fell on top of the drivers. We quit one after another. I worked at 7 to 11 for 2 years. We are the busiest gas station in the area because we were the first one off of the highway and a block from the hockey arena. When I started, the task list we had was manageable. If things were really busy, we'd miss a couple, but the next shift was able to pick it up. By the time I quit, we were lucky to finish 1/3 of the list. The area manager kept making it longer because she thought we could do more. But that's not what made me quit. I handed in my 2-week notice when we were told that we'd no longer have a cook. You know, The one who would bread and cook the chicken, wedges, and wings and fry the corn dogs. Instead they were bringing in pre-breaded garbage that the cashiers would have to throw the cook on top of all the normal stuff, which we struggled to do already. A good chunk of us quit because of that. Found out about 2 months later that the idea only lasted a month because chicken sales were only 1/3 of what they normally were. A few months after this, another good chunk left because the woman who had been working there for around 20 years left. Edit, oh damn, was not expecting to get this many upvotes. Thanks to all of you. At a salon, the owner kept stealing money from the till to buy crack. One day he fired a beloved employee for calling him out and we all walked out at the same time in solidarity. The guy everyone hated became the manager because the lousy CEO played favorites. There was a staff of 10. At the beginning of last year it was agreed if more than 50% were out sick with COVID we closed the place down for 1 week and then reassess. 9 of us were out with COVID at the same time including the boss. He threatened to fire the last person if they didn't go in and cover for 9 people including the boss. We all quit within the next month. Like hell did any of us want to be in that position, especially when the plan we co-constructed wasn't honored. Fuck profits over people. My boss used to gather everyone every morning and think he was laying down the law by gurning about whatever came to his head first thing in the morning, and he always finished up his whinge with, and if you don't like it you know where the gate is. We all got together and agreed next day when he said it we would all immediately turn and head for the gate. We were in the middle of a multi-million-pound contract and we then demanded we get better working conditions, better overtime rate and allowed days off if we needed it, otherwise we all walk. 3 of us, the engineers, quit the same week and without any discussion between ourselves. Man in charge was an insufferable, insulting twat. This led to the head office losing faith and the whole subsidiary being sold off. Business largely worked because the owner trusted his employees to do a good job. So the employees did a good job. The business was doing really well and the owner assumed it was all because of them, so he started micromanaging everyone's job. People started dropping off like flies because the working conditions became intolerable. The company didn't last very long after that. Worked at a popular burrito restaurant that was understaffed. The corporate manager implemented some policies that caused a few people to quit. Then when fall hit, some of the teenage workers quit to go back to school. Corporate manager didn't want to hire more because we could do without them. Minors were being pressured to work during their school hours, and after midnight, which is illegal. Unachievable standards were being set. Some days it would just be 2 or 3 people when there was supposed to be 9 or more. Corporate manager said we weren't allowed to hire anyone else until she could figure out why everyone was quitting. Whenever we told her why everyone was quitting, she would tell us we were just stupid and didn't know what we were talking about. New store managers were brought in. Only they had never worked at this chain restaurant before, so they were essentially just new hires. One of the new managers was sexually harassing the minors. Corporate required all our hours to be cut, so we got minimal break time. Not like where we're taking breaks anyway. Corporate manager radiated big fuck all of you vibes whenever she was around. Essentially she blamed us for being lazy and making her job harder. All through this the GM of the restaurant, really great guy, was trying his hardest to hold everything together, but the more he did, the angrier the corporate manager got, and the more arbitrary restrictions she placed on him. He started ignoring her, and she got pissed. Eventually he decided to quit, and told those of us remaining that he would help us find new jobs if we wanted to quit too. One of the big things the corporate manager told us was that we were never allowed to close the store no matter how few employees were there. Well, we all quit right before the biggest promotional event of the year. Corporate manager had to work at the store herself. She closed the store on the biggest promotional day of the year even though she forbade us from closing it on a regular day. There was a lot more going on, but I need to go to sleep. Why are the people who get to make the decisions usually the least qualified people to make the decisions? Poor pay for laborious work, passing highly qualified people up for promotions and giving that spot to someone with no experience or training in the field to someone from outside connected personally and someone in management. I happened over about a month. Me leaving was the breaking point for most people. I was the one maintenance guy that would actually answer calls and get things done. I left after getting turned down for an R&D position, which I did at my previous job in more technical field. Within a week 2 warehouse guys left, along with 3 production people, which was half of that department. Then shortly after that even the HR girl left along with the maintenance manager. It's not a big company, but a very popular one in the RVing and towing products trade. Too bad the owners only care about profit and not employees being able to afford housing. I worked in a skilled nursing facility that was amazing with many employees who had worked there for 5+ years. It got taken over by a new management company who did not give a fuck about the patients or staff at the beginning of COVID. They tried to cut pay down and force us to work longer hours than we already were. They fired our amazing director of nursing for standing up to them, demanding they stop rationing our PPE. They told us we used too much, they couldn't afford it, and we would just have to wear the same PPE the whole shift between positive and negative patients and deal with the outbreaks. We had outbreaks and many patients did not survive. It was a nightmare. Every staff member called and reported to state and quit. They called a lot of us demanding us to come back, threatening to report us to the state for patient abandonment and telling us they would take action to make us lose our licenses. Nobody came back. They had to scramble and fill our positions with registry staff that they ended up having to pay way more than they were paying us. They ended up being investigated by the state and shut down for having so many safety violations, and luckily the remaining patients got transferred to safer facilities. Worked at a catering company for 8 years. Went to culinary school, moved to the big city and started working in proper restaurants. Was trying to increase skills aggressively and would, as per agreement with chefs, work for 1 year at each place before moving on. While planning my next step, the new owner of the catering company I used to work for contacted me. I was the guy he had heard to turn the place back around. I got a generous salary and the promise of funds to replace and renew the business, which was still largely populated by my former coworkers. Guy was so full of shit. It was clear this was a misstep, but if I agree to do a job, I agree to a year contract or not. Anyway, we make about 30% of our yearly income during Thanksgiving and Christmas. Prior to Thanksgiving, he just typed up and printed a piece of paper and stuck it next to the schedule outlining pay decreases for events and the like. I told him no one would work until he met with us to discuss it. He didn't show. Those of us who could afford to leave, single, no kids or mortgage, most of us, left. He shuttered 6 months later and as a bonus to me was audited by the IRS. Lost his vacation home and law practice. Fuck him. We didn't end up quitting, but we threatened to, which caused things to change. Our project was reaching the testing phase, which would involve shipping the building-sized piece of equipment halfway across the world, and then the dev team would have to go on a movement of understanding and temporarily relocate with the unit to run the tests for about a year. Normally this is a great thing, because you get a whole bunch of tasty perks for doing it. The customer pays for your housing, which at this location was $10 a month just given to you. If you lived in the back of your car for the whole year, you banked $120 tax-free. The company gives you a movement stipend, which is used to pay for things like lawn care services so you don't get in trouble with your HOA/city rules. The smallest, temporary, bonus most people are aware of for projects of this size is on the order of 10%. Part of the reason this exists is to offset the fact that for a work of the relevant locations, we'd actually be paying taxes on our pay twice. There was a meeting where our department manager proudly went down the list of every single perk, and explained carefully how the company isn't actually going to do those this time around, and how much money the company was going to save for its profit margins as a result. They literally couldn't comprehend why this made us upset. How ripping $120 from us without asking might cause issues. How removing the movement stipend, forcing us to pay out of pocket to have someone else mow our own lawns because we weren't there while working for them, might be annoying. And how the removal of the bonus meant that for the length of the project, we'd all actually be taking a pay cut due to the double dipping on taxes. She just looked at us blankly when these concerns were raised before shrugging and asking why we couldn't just be happy working in a tropical paradise. It was pointed out by an old salt grade worker, the sort they can't fire because they are too important, that working up in the Arctic Circle is actually preferable, because when you're working 16-hour workdays 7 days a week for a full year straight, you don't really regret not being able to go outside when it's cold enough to freeze your eyeballs in minutes. The department manager informed us the decisions were final and we'd just have to deal with it. So every single member of the team said we were turning down the offer to go on the mow, which meant that in order to find people to do it, they'd have to bring in unrelated engineers, none of which were trained on the system. It would take around 4 to 5 months of them training to be able to perform the necessary tests, during which time the unit would just sit there and do nothing, costing millions in site fees, and guaranteeing the company failed to make the red line deadline for progress. A deadline that if failed to be met constitutes an immediate cancellation on a contract worth a non-trivial portion of $1 trillion over the next 80 years, in order for the runner-up company to give it a go. I'm told they eventually restored some of the perks, and people were informed that their behavior was noted in their company profiles as a negative that will be weighed in all future raise/promotion discussions. I didn't care because I quit to go back to university to get a master's degree in a completely different field. TLDR, fuck Raytheon. I worked at the largest apartment complex in my area, total 800 units, with maintenance. The office crew had about 10 people and maintenance had 9. Had a great group with an amazing property manager and maintenance supervisor. The property manager took an offer managing a beautiful resort property. In comes the new property manager who had next to no experience, and she starts to try to change things even though it ran fine like it was. She also became a mouthpiece for corporate. Everything they suggested she put straight back out to us. Within a month 7 of 9 maintenance employees put in their 2 weeks notice, including the maintenance supervisor. The next month 5 office workers had their 2 weeks in. A few months later I heard that the new property manager shut down the entire office and maintenance department to take them all to some golf tournament and got herself fired for it.